Katerina Yaka watched the German soldiers flee. Streaming from the east, that's what she was seeing. Allied bombers flew above them. She thought they all might die, and then soon there was the silence of all the SS men. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Katerina Yaka saw red flags flapping in the breeze above the Russian tanks, and she fell upon her knees. And so many different voices in so many different tongues sang the most beautiful song that could ever have been sung. In German, Lithuanian, in Polish and in Dutch, a myriad of melodies has never had been such. In Russian and in Yiddish, Italian and French, emerging from the forests beneath the trench. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. When the sun rose the next morning, it was the 1st of May, and they all sang the Internationale. They all sang the Internationale. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht. Völker hört die Signale auf zum letzten Gefecht. Die Internationale erkämpft das Menschenrecht.
Hello and welcome to Revolutionary Socialist Review. This is the episode for April 24th, 2022. First up on our list tonight is Ukraine is a pawn on the grand chessboard by Rick Sterling for popular resistance. And this was published on April 23rd, 2022. And he says, Rick Sterling says, Ukraine is a pawn on the grand chessboard. Chessboard was published 25 years ago. Zbigniew Brzezinski's assumptions and strategies for maintaining U.S. global dominance have been hugely influential in U.S. foreign policy. As the conflict in Ukraine evolves, with the potential of escalating into a world war, we can see where this policy leads and how crucial it is to reevaluate. The basic premise of Grand Chessboard, the Grand Chessboard, is outlined in the introduction. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, the United States is the sole global power. Europe and Asia, Eurasia, together have the largest land area, population, and economy. U.S. must control Eurasia and prevent another country from challenging U.S. dominance. Brzezinski sums up the situation. America is now the only global superpower. The Eurasia is the globe's central arena. He adds, It is imperative that no Eurasian challenger emerges capable of dominating Eurasia and thus of challenging America. The book surveys the different nations in Eurasia, from Japan in the east to the UK in the west. The entire landmass of Europe and Asia is covered. This is the grand chessboard, and Brzezinski analyzes how the US should play different pieces on the board to keep potential rivals down and the US in control. Brzezinski was a very powerful national security advisor to President Carter. Before that, he founded the Trilateral Commission. Later, he taught Madeleine Albright and many other key figures in US foreign policy. Brzezinski initiated the Afghanistan trap. That was the secret 1979 US program to mobilize and support Mujahideen foreign fighters to invade and destabilize Afghanistan. In this period, Afghanistan was undergoing dramatic positive changes. As described by Canadian academic John Ryan, Afghanistan once had a progressive secular government with a broad popular support. It had enacted progressive reforms and given equal rights to women. Brzezinski's plan, the Brzezinski plan, was to utilize reactionary local forces and foreign fighters to create enough mayhem that the government would ask the neighboring Soviet Union to send military support. The overall goal was to bog down the Soviet army and give them their own Vietnam. With enormous funding from the US and Saudi Arabia beginning in 1978, the plan resulted in chaos, starvation, bloodshed in Afghanistan, which continues to today. Approximately 6 million Afghans became refugees fleeing the chaos and war. Years later, when interviewed about this policy, Brzezinski was proud and explicit. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. When asked if he had regrets for the decades of mayhem in Afghanistan, he was clear. Regret what? That secret operation was an excellent idea. It had the effect of drawing the Russians into the Afghan trap. And you want me to regret it? Afghanistan was a pawn in the US campaign against the Soviet Union. The amorality of the US foreign policy is clear and consistent from the destruction of Afghanistan beginning in 1978, continuing to the current starvation caused by US freezing of Afghan government's reserves. The blowback is also clear. The foreign fighters trained by the US and Saudis became Al-Qaeda and then ISIS. Brzezinski presents Ukraine as the pivotal country for containing Russia. He says Ukraine is the critical state that, insofar as Russia's future evolution is concerned. He says, without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. This is another example of his skillful wording, because Ukraine, as part of a hostile military alliance, does not only prevent a Russian empire, it presents a potential threat. Kiev is less than 500 miles from Moscow, and Ukraine, was a major route of the Nazi invasion. Brzezinski was well aware of the controversial nature of Ukraine's borders. On page 104, he gives a quote that shows many people of eastern Ukraine wanted out of Ukraine since the breakup of the Soviet Union. The 1996 quote from a Moscow newspaper reports, in the foreseeable future, events in eastern Ukraine confront Russia with a very difficult problem. Mass manifestations of discontent will be accompanied by appeals to Russia or even demands to take over the region. Brzezinski realizes that Russia presents a potential challenge to U.S. domination of Eurasia, especially if it allies with China. In Grand Chessboard, he writes, if the middle space rebuffs the West, becomes an assertive single entity, and either gains control over the South or forms an alliance with the major Eastern actor, then America's primacy in Eurasia shrinks dramatically. Russia is the middle space, and China is the major Eastern actor. What was feared by the U.S. strategists has happened. For the past 20 years, Russia and China have been building an alliance dedicated to ending U.S. hegemony and beginning a new era of international relations. This may be why the U.S. aggressively provoked the crisis in Ukraine. The list of provocations is clear: moral and material support for Maidan's protests, rejection of the EU agreement, fuck the EU, as anyway, the sniper murders and violent 2014 coup, ignoring the Minsk agreements approved by the UN Security Council, NATO advisors in training for ultra-nationalists, lethal weaponry to Ukraine, refusal to accept Ukrainian non-membership in NATO, threats to invade Donbass and Crimea. As with Afghanistan, the U.S. didn't push Russia to intervene, but knowingly increased the probability that they would. The purpose is the same, but in both cases, to use a pawn to undermine and potentially eliminate a rival. We expect the U.S. will make every effort to prolong the bloodshed and war, to bog down the Russian army and prevent a peaceful settlement. The U.S. goal is just what Joe Biden said: regime change in Moscow. Like Afghanistan, Ukraine is just a pawn on the chessboard.
This really does seem like what people like Malcolm Nance are trying to do. You know, Malcolm Nance, the intelligence asset who recently joined the Ukrainian military, and he has been.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I saw a picture of him today with all his with his M16 or whatever, and his in his army uniform.
And that's what their dual warfare of propaganda, which Malcolm Nance is mainly focused on throughout the years, and proxy warfare is focused on to destabilize, to disrupt. But we'll see if they're going to be successful, because Putin is increasingly winning in Russia, even if you don't admit that he's winning in Ukraine. And I don't know what to think about that, because the information I'm hearing is so mixed. The U.S. media even admits that Putin is winning in Russia. He's increasingly popular because of his being willing to take decisive action, and the ruble has recovered, in contrast to how U.S. hegemony, the Western economies are floundering.
Well, while Putin is winning in Russia, Russia is winning in Ukraine, hands down. And there's absolutely no doubt to me. The Ukrainian army, or as it stands right now, is on its last legs. The United States can send more garbage to them, but they're not going to be there to use it. They don't have gasoline for their goddamn, for motor vehicles. They don't have ammunition for their guns. They're on their last legs. So the United States can continue to pump more and more. Here's the thing. Russia is not the Soviet Union of the 1990s, and the United States is not the United States of the 1990s. The United States was tremendously more powerful in the 1990s than it is today because of decades of decline and collapse. And the Russia of today, although half the size, quite a bit smaller, is leaner and meaner than the Soviet Union was in the 1990s. So, or the 1980s leading up to the early 1990s. There's just no contest. I mean, at this point, I don't see any way that the Ukrainians could come out of this alive, much less actually winning. I mean, there's absolutely no chance that it could win. That's my opinion after listening to real military experts on the subject, not listening to American propagandists, but real military experts who know what the fuck they're talking about. So, from the way that Zelensky has talked about it, it seems like he's tried to cope with this reality by vowing to intensify internal repression within Ukraine. He said that he's done a lot of that. Yeah.
Yes, he said that Ukraine is going to become...
here's this Jewish man who could never support Nazis. He's today running Ukraine like a Nazi would. Not to mention all of his support for actual Nazis. So,
right.
A Jew can't be a Nazi. Yeah.
And the interesting detail about that is he's specifically said Ukraine will become a big Israel. And you know how Israel has parallels with Nazi Germany.
Right.
So there's how even a Jewish person can behave like a Nazi. They can take example from...
Israel has been behaving like Nazis ever since its inception. And much before that, the forces that led to the formation of Israel, they were fascists. They were open, out and out fascists. A Jew can't be a fascist. You've got your head up your ass if you say that. I mean, look at the history of Israel and tell me a Jew can't be a fascist. I won't say Nazi, although in the case of Ukraine, Zelensky is openly supporting the Nazis, and the Nazis are in fact running the country. So it's a bunch of bullshit, Anyway, number 2 on the list, Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov's interview with India Today television channel, Moscow, April 19th, 2022. Sergey sat down with India Today. India Today is a kind of an interesting thing. I watch it occasionally. They've got shows on the internet and so forth, and they're absolutely pro-American 100%. I mean, there's no two ways about that. But occasionally they'll have something interesting on there. And in this one, they definitely did have something interesting, and that was Sergey Lavrov. Question. This is from the India Today. Big question that most are asking is the reason for this operation, the reason for President Putin to take the country to war at a time when we have seen negotiations and talks taking place. What was the reason? We know that America said that Russia was going to carry out operations. New Delhi certainly was not aware of it. Many countries said that this is not something that is going to happen, but it did happen. Sergey Lavrov. The real reason is the complacency of most countries of the world after the end of World War II, when our Western colleagues, led by the United States, declared themselves winners, and in violation of the promises to the Soviet and Russian leadership, started moving NATO eastward. They kept saying, don't worry, this is a defensive alliance. It's not a threat to Russian security. It was a defensive alliance when there were NATO and Warsaw Treaty, and there was the Berlin Wall, as you remember, both physical and geopolitical. It was very clear that was the line of defense for this defensive alliance. When the opponent disappeared, when both the Warsaw Treaty disappeared and Soviet Union disappeared, they decided they will move the line of defense eastward. They did this 5 times without explaining against whom they are going to defend themselves, but in the process building up their advanced assault capabilities and choosing the former Soviet republics, especially Ukraine, as the springboard against the Russian interests. As early as 2003, for example, when they had a presidential election in Ukraine, the West was publicly and blatantly demanding Ukrainians, you must choose. Are you with Russia or with Europe? Then, of course, they started pulling Ukraine into the European Union Association Agreement. The agreement provided for 0 tariffs for Ukraine, for Ukrainian goods in Europe, and European goods in Ukraine. We had a free trade agreement with Ukraine in the context of the Commonwealth of Independent States. So we told our Ukrainian neighbors, guys, we have 0 tariffs with you, but we have protection with the European Union because we negotiated WTO entry for 18 years. For some time, we did manage to protect some sectors of the Russian economy, agriculture, insurance, banking, and some others, with considerable tariffs. We told them, if you have 0 tariffs with Europe and 0 tariffs with us, we are not protected against European goods. It's pretty simple, really, which was part of the deal when we entered WTO. Then in 2013, when the Ukrainian president understood the problem, he asked European Union to to postpone the signature of the association agreement. We suggested that the three of us, Russia, Ukraine, and the EU, could sit down together and discuss how to proceed. The European Union, in a very arrogant way, said that this is none of your business. We do not put our nose in your trade with China or other countries, so this is going to happen. Then the president of Ukraine decided to postpone this ceremony. The next morning, the demonstrations were on Maidan in Kiev. In February 14, the European Union helped negotiate a deal between the president and the opposition. Next morning, the signatures of the European Union representatives, France, Germany, Poland, were absolutely ignored by the opposition, who staged a coup and declared that they are creating a government of winners, that they will cancel the special status of the Russian language. They threatened to throw ethnic Russians out of Crimea. They sent armed groups to storm the Crimean parliament. We didn't want to have anything to do with you. Leave us alone. As I said, there was a threat from armed groups. The eastern areas of Ukraine said, guys, we do not support your coup. Leave us alone. They never attacked the rest of Ukraine. The pushists attacked them, having called them terrorists. They called them terrorists for 8 long years. We managed to stop this bloodshed in February 2015. The so-called Minsk agreements were signed, providing Eastern Ukraine with some special status, language, the right to have some local police, special economic relations with the adjacent Russian regions. It was basically the same as the agreement the European Union negotiated for North Kosovo, where Serbs live. In both cases, the European Union failed totally to deliver on what was guaranteed by the signatures of its members. For 8 long years, respective governments of Ukraine, the presidents of Ukraine, were saying blatantly and publicly they were not going to improve the Minsk, implement the Minsk agreements, that they will move to Plan B. They continued to shell the territories of these self-proclaimed republics during all these years. We warned the Europeans and the Americans, and Ukraine, that they are ignoring something which was endorsed by the United Nations Security Council to no avail. People do not want to go back into history because they prefer to take events on their immediate merit. But these particular events are rooted in the desire of the United States and what we call the collective West to rule, to dominate the world, and just show everybody that there were to be no multipolarity. It would only be unipolarity. And that they can declare Iraq, Syria, Libya, Yugoslavia, located tens of thousands of miles from the United States, threats to their security, and can do whatever they please there, leveling cities like they did with Mosul in Iraq or Raqqa in Syria. Russia has been warning all its colleagues that just on our borders, you have been creating a springboard against us. You have been pumping arms into Ukraine. You have been totally ignoring the legislation of Ukraine, which completely prohibited the Russian language. You have been encouraging neo-Nazi ideologies and practices. The neo-Nazi battalions were very much active against the territories which proclaimed themselves independent. That is Donetsk, and he's talking about Donetsk and Lugansk there, and who were promised special status. It's inside Ukraine. They were promised a special status under the Minsk agreements, but Ukraine and its allies have signed the Minsk agreements and have just ignored it since then. It was all linked with Ukraine becoming NATO's springboard and NATO expansion. They were saying that Ukraine will be in NATO. Nobody can stop Ukraine if it so wishes. Then President Zelensky said that he might think about coming back to the process to possess nuclear weapons. In November last year, my president suggested to the United States and to NATO to sit down, to cool off, and to discuss how we can agree on security guarantees without NATO's further eastward expansion. They refused. In the process, the Ukrainian army radically intensified the shelling of those republics and that's Donetsk Republic in Lugansk that he's talking about there, in violation of all ceasefire agreements. We didn't have any other choice but to recognize them, to sign mutual assistance treaties with them, and in response to their request to send our troops as part of special operation to protect their lives.
You know what's indicative of where Russia is coming at this situation is the fact that Putin isn't trying to regime change Ukraine. Zelensky has said he's going to stay in power, and with the country's fascistic power structure, that's in all likelihood going to be true. And Putin hasn't been trying to do to Zelensky what George W. Bush did to Saddam Hussein. And you know that's morally ambiguous because Putin is likely doing this to avoid all-out World War III, which is what such a drastic maneuver would entail. Putin is already treading very, very thin. He really needs to be careful to not provoke World War III, as indicated by how he's really making an effort to refrain from killing civilians. And the cost of this is going to be, I fear, that in the next few years, Ukraine is going to rearm under Zelensky, and we're going to see a repeat of this. I mean, do fascists ever learn their lesson? They're not going to learn their lesson from getting beaten back like this. They're going to try to come back with a vengeance. I hope this doesn't turn into some kind of cycle.
Yeah, really. Okay, next on the list. We will become a big Israel, inspired by Zionism. Zelensky aims to intensify Ukraine's genocide, by Rainer Shea.
Earlier this month, Zelensky made that comment, and he attached it to a statement about how there's going to be a greatly intensified presence for the Ukrainian National Guard in daily Ukrainian life, how they're going to be patrolling public spaces, grocery stores, stuff like that. At least that's what he seemed to have implied. And that's quite alarming because you can easily point to atrocities that have been committed since the Euromaidan coup by the Ukrainian National Guard in particular. They've been committing war crimes, ethnic cleansing, human rights abuses in tandem with the neo-Nazi paramilitaries. And now we see this guy taking direct example, explicit example from potentially the most evil state on the planet, probably next to the United States itself, Israel, he is taking direct example from Israeli apartheid, and this is a sign of even greater human rights abuses within that country. Like I said, I feel like the Ukrainian ultra-nationalists are trying to compensate for their humiliation by Russia by intensifying their abuses against the Jews, Romas, ethnic Russians, LGBT people, journalists, communists, other political dissidents within that country. And Zelensky, even though he's Jewish, is obviously complacent in this and doesn't seem to really care about the abuses against his own people.
Complicit.
Yes, complicit.
You said complacent. Complicit.
I guess there is quite a difference between those terms.
Yeah. He's not complacent. He's actively helping the Nazis and the other fascist forces in Ukraine.
And this is going
so
to...
it's no surprise at all that he's buddying up with the Zionists.
And what's that indicate? It indicates, like I said, a renewed effort to arm Ukraine, to stoke neo-Nazi terrorism within the country, and to try to make that spill over perhaps into the newly independent Eastern republics. These are the kinds of tactics we're going to see in the coming years, and they're going to involve, I believe, Blackwater, now called Academy. Eric Prince's mercenary company has been involved with the neo-Nazi militias in Ukraine, and they've been developing plans to, it seems, create some sort of home base within Ukraine for carrying out violence throughout the region. And that fits right in with what Zelensky was talking about. So in Ukraine in the coming years, we're going to see more chaos, more human rights abuses, more deterioration of living standards, to the point where we could see maybe an alternate scenario for what would have been the collapse of Nazi Germany, where instead of getting invaded, and that's how they fell, maybe they would have just internally collapsed through their own contradictions. And that's plausible because the US empire, regardless, is now in rapid retreat. When it loses this war, it's going to have its hands tied in an unprecedented extent. And that's going to have consequences for the regime. It's a very unstable situation.
Yeah. Well, this is the reason that Vladimir Putin is part of the reason that Vladimir Putin is denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine. I don't know if Zelensky will last. I doubt it. But if he does, he's going to be the president of a country with no military, lots of weapons, but no one to shoot them. Lots of weapons because the United States and 20 other countries keep shipping them in, but he's not going to have any people to shoot those weapons. He's going to just have to go out on the street and at gunpoint force people into the military. Meanwhile, a large part of Ukraine will no longer be Ukraine. The East, the South will no longer be Ukraine. So what he has left, you know, the only unfortunate thing about this is that there are still a lot of Russians, ethnic Russians and Russian-speaking people who live in the rest of Ukraine. They don't only live in the east and the south. They live in the rest of Ukraine too. So he can still apply this Israeli Zionist method of fascist governance of those Russian-speaking people. In other words, treating them as second-class citizens, treating them as slaves, basically. So, you know, Putin is obviously hoping that just denazifying and demilitarizing Ukraine will do the trick, and that he can just leave Ukraine alone, that he can take the eastern part and the southern part of Ukraine, where the majority of ethnic Russians live, and add that as part of the greater Russia, and leave Ukraine to its own devices. But I do not think it's going to work out that way, because what he's going to find is that these Nazis and fascists who run Ukraine are, if Russia pins down the Ukrainian army in the various places that it's been pinned down, and then demobilizes them, that's not going to do the trick. Zelensky, with the police and with a new army that he creates out of a heavy-handed draft, he's still going to do whatever he can to oppress Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian people in Ukraine, even after all that has occurred.
Well, I feel like then that's a strategic weakness of how Putin views the world, because there's a difference between that and what Stalin did, which was obviously to overthrow Hitler, not just take away Hitler's most immediate tools. And it's ironic because in his speech on the war, Putin criticized Stalin for supposedly having helped Hitler with the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, which
is nonsense.
Yeah, yeah. So Putin, he's definitely an opportunist, and
well, a lot of what Putin says, he says because that's what he thinks the Russian people want to hear, and obviously he's doing a good job at that, because something like 80% of Russia today supports Putin. That's way more than the number who voted for him. So he's won over a lot of new people. He's doing what the Russian people want to see, but that's not the same thing as a realistic look at what Ukraine is. And what it's telling us is that he's going to have to start borrowing a few pages from Stalin. He's going to have to defeat these Nazis once and for all. So, okay, next on the list, U.S. vows more weapons supply to Ukraine aimed at prolonged attrition to Russia. And this is, give me a second here while I scroll down to it. Okay. While the Russian-Ukraine crisis enters a new phase as fighting in the Donbass region intensifies, the U.S. and its Western allies pledged more military assistance to Kiev, ramping up efforts to pressure and consume the power of Russia. As the world closely watches whether Moscow could quickly advance its military deployment and reach its objective as completely liberating Donetsk and Lugansk ahead of its planned military parade on May 9th. Some experts said the crisis appeared to turn into an attritional conflict that could last beyond months, on which the U.S. hegemony the root cause of the conflict, continues fanning the flames so the US could gain more profits on geopolitical, military, and economic aspects. On the day Russia moved into the second phase of its military operation in Ukraine that has lasted 2 months, the US planned to supply Ukraine another $800 million in military assistance, according to media reports. The US has pledged more than $3 billion in military assistance to Ukraine since the military conflict began. Its major allies, including the UK and Canada, also vowed to send more weapons to Ukraine. Such prepped up military assistance echoed the previous rounds of the US-led economic sanctions against Moscow, aiming to cause maximum pain on Russian President Vladimir Putin to further isolate Russia. Dmitry Polyanovsky, Russia's deputy permanent representative to the UN, said during the UN Security Council meeting on Tuesday that the West only has their own interests in mind. The weapons producers in Western countries are eagerly rubbing their hands, calculating their profits from the increased demand on military products. He was quoted as saying in a report by US media Newsweek.
I feel like that factor of the U.S. military-industrial complex seeking to create a perpetual stream of profits from this really highlights the short-sighted nature of capitalism and of imperialism, because in the short term, the capitalists obviously see great profits, but in the long term, they're driving forward the collapse of the system that they depend on, U.S. hegemony. The more that they invest into the military, the more unhappy the American people get, because they're getting neglected amid crushing sanctions that are crushing them by proxy.
Yeah.
And then on the other side, you have Putin not willing to commit to denazifying, as in he's not willing to do what Stalin did, and that's going to perpetuate the cycle. So you have bourgeois leaders on both sides not doing what it takes to really end this cycle of conflict. And I feel like in the long term, that is going to jeopardize both the capitalist Russian state and the U.S. imperialist capitalist state.
Yeah, good point. Good point. Okay, next on the list, Ukraine's US-backed mercenaries, imperialism's inward turn, and the evolution of colonial violence. Rainer Shea. And while you go on with this, I'm going to step away for a minute.
I talked about how there's been this mercenary effort within Ukraine, how Blackwater, now called Academy, has been aiding the militias in Ukraine, carrying out a destabilization effort throughout the region, or at least that's seemingly their plan. And that really parallels what's been happening in Minneapolis, Minnesota during the last year, where following the murder of Winston Smith, one of the many black men killed by police, there was this mercenary company. I think it's called the Conflict. Its name pertains to de-escalating conflict, like finding an alternative to conflict. But in reality, de-escalating conflict is the last thing they do, because they constantly pick fights, one-sided fights with the civil rights protesters in the area. They've set up camp in this one prominent part of Minneapolis, and they've been surveilling local activists, assaulting people, detaining people arbitrarily in partnership with the Minneapolis Police Department. They've been gathering intel on activists so that they can intimidate them by shouting out their names during public confrontations. They've been pulling all of this shady stuff, and clearly the purpose of this mercenary company is to carry out a broader destabilization of Black Lives Matter activism, social movements in general, within the Minneapolis metropolitan area, Minneapolis-St. Paul area. And I just think it's interesting how there's this parallel in how mercenary companies operate, whether they're a relatively small scale operation in an American city area or a more substantial operation that's targeting broader Eurasia. They have the same nature, and their same purpose is to destabilize the opponents of U.S. imperialism, whether external imperialism or internal imperialism.
Okay. Next on our list, Ukraine. A new witness, a new consensus on whiteness by Ajamu Baraka. He's the editor and a columnist for the Black Agenda Report. This is from the 20th of April, 2022. Okay. The Biden administration and corporate media cover up the existence of white supremacists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine. They are disappeared from the official narrative in order to get public buy-in for U.S. policy. In 1999, U.S. and NATO forces bombed Serbia for 78 days, ushering a new century further characterized by war and militarism, with no negative consequences of military overreach, especially after the dismantling of the Soviet Union. The U.S. unleashed war in its various forms, from direct attacks to sanctions, drones, and subversion, with a wanton disregard for its human and political consequences. Yet even when the massive numbers of U.S. troops were deployed in places like Afghanistan and Iraq and other ancient cities whose names are in the great religious texts of the world, and reduced them to rubble, the awful reality of war was carefully hidden from the U.S. public. U.S. propagandists had learned from the Vietnam experience that it was much safer to shield the public from the brutality that their troops were dishing out to poor villagers, students, ordinary workers, and anyone who dared to resist the military might of the U.S. military on a daily basis. But the Ukraine war, at least the portion that began with the Russian special operation in February, was one of those instances where exposure to dehumanized reality of war was welcomed. Why? The images of burnt out buildings and frightened refugees crossing the frontier of nations that border Ukraine served an especially important purpose. It was to generate public support for the war. War in support of Ukraine and revulsion against Russian invaders. And it did not hurt that the victims were white. An important lesson was learned from the US and NATO wars to dismember Yugoslavia in the 1990s, and it was that white victims made selling war amazingly easy, especially when framed as a humanitarian mission to rescue people from tyranny. We know what emerged from this discovery. The ideological weapon of humanitarian intervention and the mantra, responsibility to protect, became invaluable to justify imperialist war, even when the victims were not white, because an appeal could be made to another powerful force, liberal white saviorism. That whitewashing, coupled with the inordinate attention given to war, with the inevitable sympathy for the white victim of this war, a war motivated by the desire of Ukrainians to join Europe, to defend Europeness and European civilization, revealed a contradiction that has always been present at the heart of the emergence of what became Europe. That contradiction was the hyper-valuation of white lives, of whiteness, in relation to the radicalized others, a contradiction that I refer to as White Lives Matter More movement. This whitewashing of Ukraine is particularly dangerous because it is occurring at a historic moment of deep crisis for the global capitalist order, producing proto-fascist movements across Europe that are becoming more visible and bolder. As I said in previous writings on this subject, US authorities and the US and Western European press understood that Ukraine had an active problem with white supremacist, ultra-nationalists, and literal neo-Nazis. Nonetheless, in order to engender support for Ukraine and to set the stage for the performance of a lifetime for Volodymyr Zelensky, Ukraine's actor president, Ukraine had to be recruited minus ultranationalists, influence, and Nazis. And I'll just say that there, as with all of these articles that I've been pointing to, there's a lot more to them than the highlights that I'm giving. So take a look at the entire article, especially this one by Ajamu, which is really quite good. Take a look at the entire thing. We'll have the link up under this video.
There's an unsettling byproduct of what's been taking place, where there's been this campaign to manufacture consent for this perpetual war in Ukraine, and it's fueling, whether intentionally or not, because I doubt that most of the people parroting these talking points know what the heck they're talking about, white nationalism. White nationalists, no doubt, are able to use this as fodder for their ideas, and that starts with you could say complacency among global liberals as opposed to complicity, because again, they don't know what the heck they're talking about. They are willfully ignorant, whereas someone like Zelensky, who's centrally involved in this game, is not ignorant at all. He knows exactly what he's doing. These Western liberals, for the most part, do not know what they're doing, and that makes them the perfect pawns for the fascists. They're being used by the fascists as pawns for the most part, because somebody like Kamala Harris probably knows what's up, but is more sinister in that way. Anyway, this is a warning sign for a rise of global fascism, at least throughout the capitalist countries.
Yes, very well put. Okay, that's it for us tonight. I want to thank you, Rainer, and thank all of our viewers for tuning in. And hopefully you'll tune in again next week when we produce for you another episode of Revolutionary Socialist Review. Until then, I bid you a sweet adieu.